All right. Well, I guess since I've been elected to kick things off, I guess we're doing this recorded discussion for Alaska Book Week about writing historical novels and the various processes, the various pieces and parts that go into that sort of thing. My name's Kris Farmen. We also have Ewoyn Ivey, Erik Hirschmann, and Tuzroyluke. Am I saying that right? I always feel like I'm
Yes,
saying it
yeah.
wrong. And yeah, so I guess I've also been elected to kick things off here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go around and each of us has come with some questions that we want to pose to the group. And then we're going to, so like to start off with, I'll ask one of my questions and then everybody else will give an answer. And then somebody else will take a turn answering, or excuse me, asking a question. And we'll just kind of go around the room like that. So just to get this going, well, so there's, I've written quite a bit of historical fiction, and something I always seem to bump into is this idea of the connection between the past and the present. There's this sort of idea that floats around that historical fiction is just as much about the age in which it's written than it is about the age in which it takes place. And so I guess I was wondering I was wondering if people could talk about this a little bit. Like, there's William Faulkner's sort of famous quote that the past isn't dead, it's not even past. But at the same time, there's also this, I guess, this, what you call it, an idea that the past is a foreign country and it's best to approach it as such. And so I guess I was wondering how you guys handle this connection between past and present in your work. And I guess, I don't know. Why don't we start with Erik?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great start off question, Kris. And I that's actually one of my mantras is the past is like a foreign country, and uh, I do stay very mindful of that. When I wrote, for example, when I wrote Voyage of the Eclipse, I said this is like a foreign country, going back over 200 years ago. But I also strove to make it relatable to the present day. As far as the dialogue, for example, I mostly said it in, just contemporary American English, for not all, but most of the characters. And yeah, I think uh, keeping it, treating it like a foreign country, for example, but striving it to make it relatable to everyday people today. I think and it's a hard balance. It's not easy to accomplish.
Yeah, I just kind of piggybacking on that. I think it's a really interesting dilemma when you're writing historical fiction of writing true as you can to the time, but like you say, wanting to make it relatable and interesting to the present, but also you're also dealing with the reader's expectations of what the history was, both in terms of wanting to redefine maybe a little bit what their understanding of history is, but also knowing that they have their prejudices about what people were like back then or how they spoke. And I just find that a really interesting, sometimes even down to word choice, where you didn't realize that people used certain words even 150 years ago, but they did. But your reader is going to say, "Oh no, that's anachronistic" or whatever. So I think that back and forth between current and history is just an important part of the whole, and kind of the fun, but also the challenge. And with that in mind, I ended up framing into The Bright Edge of the World. I used a framing device of two modern people to kind of be able to have some of that dialogue more out front, because I felt like there were things that I wanted to talk about that weren't being talked about my characters from 1885. So I really literally brought the present into the whole discussion because I wanted to be able to do that real openly. But
Yes, connecting the past with the present. And it is, for myself, it can be a lot of work as a writer doing the research. But I definitely find it as part of my inspiration, my motivations as a writer. It's really knowing when to stop and saying, okay, I've done enough research, and now it's time to do the actual writing of the story and the characters. But the as far as the indigenous view of the past is really land-based, and as part of our cultural identity, and looking at the history of the land is important. How we form our perspective as an indigenous person. It isn't just a peninsula. It's not just a point. It is where I buried my father. It is where my peoples have been wailing for centuries. So it's really beyond the historical facts. It can also mean this emotional connections and spiritual. Yeah, thanks. Grateful to be here.
All right. Well, who's next?
Is that me? I think.
Oh yeah, I
So
guess you're.
we're going alphabetical, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Lily did mention this briefly, but I had a question. When is enough research enough when writing historical fiction? Where is there any exact point where you say, okay, no more, this is enough? Or is it just a continuous process, going back, nibbling here and there for more information? Or I was just curious what your processes were in writing your books, historical fiction.
Yeah,
Who
I
wants to
mean,
go
I'll jump
first?
in. I think it's a total dilemma because I don't know about you. As much as I say I want to write, I actually find writing sometimes really hard, and it's something I want to avoid sometimes. And so the research becomes this sort of little escape route for me. Like if I, and what usually will happen is it's some real specific thing that I need to know, like when were strike matches invented or whatever, But then you start to go nosedive into it, and I do think at times I had to say, okay, I need to just turn all that off. I would go somewhere where I didn't have Wi-Fi, so I would just focus on the material I already have, and I would stop looking things up. At the same time, I mean, it's just this endless wealth of great inspiration and facts that just feed the process. So it is, for me, it is a little bit of a dilemma that I had to, and I found through, I was doing research up to the very end of when I finished my novel, but I had to make sure I spent the time actually doing the writing too, which was hard sometimes.
Yes, I have a very structured routine that I try and stick to. I set a goal, a numerical goal at the beginning of my writing process. I will free write 1,500 words, or I will edit a certain number of pages or, word count, because I can very easily just get lost into the one question that I have for the day, like, how long was this volcano eruption that happened? And um, uh, it's really this messy process that I'm trying to streamline, and because you're really just grabbing stuff from so many different sources, whether it's history or it's your imagination. And I'm always trying to improve that process, knowing that I can get caught up in one question, or some minor details, or just going through words. Like, I have to tell myself, okay, it's time to stop. You need to focus on your goal for the day.
Well, I think for my part, I I actually started writing as a technical writer, as a historical and archaeological consultant. And so, I came to writing from a background where, the time that you spent researching was very compartmentalized, and the time that you spent writing was very compartmentalized. And so I
Mhm.
think that's just kind of how my brain got trained to think about all this. Whether I'm writing, some technical report of field work, or whether I'm writing a novel. And I think, you know, it's handy training because, as I'm sure we all know, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody, like I think Ewoyn said, when were strike matches invented? I could spend all day reading about that, or like, I don't know what kind of harpoon points were in use in Alaska in the 1890s for whaling, or for Inupiaq seal hunters, or whatever the thing is. And I'm sure we all have our things like that. Um, but I think for me, there's a really definite point where it's time to stop researching and just tell the damn story, kind of thing. Like and I think the way I work is like I do the research, then I write the story, and then as I'm going back through my reading back to my first draft, I'm usually making notes on the manuscript. Um, I still edit the old-fashioned way on paper. I'm making notes on the manuscript of I need to research, was this style of clothing in fashion or whatever. But I think I've also had to learn that sometimes you just got to let the little things go. Does it really change the story if you're talking about some really specific style of tin can, and whether that tin can was in use and commonly available in interior Alaska in 1886 or whatever it is. So it's, and in its own way, I imagine any novel that one works on, historical or otherwise. I mean, you could be writing a sci-fi novel, and you could go off on some long diatribe of, whatever space alien, what where their society comes from or whatever. But I don't know, you got to learn to pull the reins in,
Yeah, it can get to be kind of a compulsion because I hate being wrong. I mean, I don't like having errors in my manuscript, And I've been derailed reading other people's manuscripts. If I happen to notice some stupid little thing wrong, it kind of shatters the illusion a little bit, and then I find myself looking for the errors. So that's the kind of the one catch in the whole thing is it's like you want to get everything right, but at some point you do kind of have to let go. And I had someone, a reader, catch that I used the word aspirin and that wasn't in use. And I had a chance that I could have edited it in the paperback version. And I just was like, I can't find a better word and I'm just going to use it. It came out as aspirin like 2 years later. Fine, I'm just going to leave it, because it can become a bit of a trap trying to get all those things right. And yet I don't want to be wrong. So yeah, it's hard.
There's a great line from it's Peter Matheson. He wrote The Snow Leopard and a bunch of other novels. He has this great line from it's at the beginning of like the prelude or prologue to one of his novels that's set in historical Florida, and he says, there are many things in this novel that did not happen, but there's nothing in this novel that could not have happened. And that's kind of my guiding principle, I think, with
Yeah.
with that need to kind of stop worrying about the minutia and just tell the story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just say when I wrote my book, I was very conscious of not trying to smother the reader with too much detail. I think sometimes, it's easy to fall into that trap, just because you're excited. You want to say, look at all this stuff I know and look at all these details. And I kept telling myself, you got to, just keep dragging yourself back, focus on the story. Don't obsess too much with detail. And for myself personally, I would just say with the research, Lily mentioned she was very disciplined and structured. I was sort of a chaotic mess. I went back and forth,
Yeah.
writing. No way, I got to go do some more research there, and I'd come back, write some more, and yeah. So that's why I asked the question, because I was it was my first historical novel, and it was pretty messy and chaotic for a lot of it, going back and forth, writing and doing research. So definitely
When you had to do
difficult.
research all over the world too,
Yeah,
because
yeah. So somehow I was able to get the book done and get it published, but Yeah, it was, and of course, being a history professor, I'm a history, PhD in history. I'm a nerd, when it comes to history. And I'm sort of like a bottomless pit as far as acquiring more and more knowledge, historical knowledge. And that was really tough for me, just trying to stay disciplined and just focus on, getting the story out and
Well, so can
yeah.
I ask, like, from one history nerd to another, I mean,
Yeah.
as a professor, I'm wondering, did you ever have a moment when you're like maybe reading back through a draft and you were like, oh man, my job here is not to feed my readers their vegetables and give them a history lesson. My job
Mhm.
is to tell them a compelling story. I mean, because I mean,
Yeah.
I've had that happen to me,
Mhm.
and I'm wondering if that ever happened to you.
Oh, all the time. It was when I wrote the book, I was like, okay, can't I kept envisioning myself in sometimes in the classroom teaching, and it's like, no, 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 you can't do that.
Yeah.
This is a different way of talking about history, and I wanted the story to be, not just entertaining but informational, and but it was hard. It was definitely difficult, drawing that line, that disciplined line, saying, okay, this is enough research for this. I'll just, there's one early chapter, the early part of my book, I talked about the Juan Fernandez Islands off the Chilean coast, and I really didn't know anything about those islands, but I looked on the map and I say, hey, that would be a good place for the ship to stop. And so I dove into a lot of research and, learned from scratch what the history of those islands and what happened over 200 years ago. And I was so fascinated. I just kept digging deeper and deeper and deeper. And I said, okay, Erik, you got to stop. This is enough. This is just a small part of the story. So
This actually ties into the question that I wanted to ask, because my sense, and I'll let you guys kind of talk about it more. I I think it was Andromeda, Romana Lax, who first said to me something about being a historical fiction writer. And I was like, wait, what? I'm not a historical fiction writer. I'm like, and she's like, well, wait, your first book set in 1920, your second book set in 1885, but that wasn't how I thought of myself. I thought of myself as a writer who sometimes is drawn towards historical times. My new book is set in like the 80s and the 90s, which my kids will think is historical, but for me, it's my life, right? So that bringing this, Erik and Kris, it sounds like you guys both kind of come more from the history, like that's a starting place, maybe a little bit. With Lily, I'm curious, Lily, like, do you think of yourself as a historical writer, or did it just happen that at the one story that you wanted to tell at that one point happened to be set in a certain time? Do you know what I mean? Because I think of myself just as a writer. And I'm curious to hear from the rest of you guys. Do you think of yourself as a historian first, a general writer, or a historical writer? I'm just kind of curious about that.
Yes, I consider myself I'm sorry, did my microphone
I
is
can hear
my
you.
microphone working? Okay, good.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
can hear you.
Yes, I definitely consider myself a writer, first and foremost. I don't think it was later on until the process of after the publication and they ask you, okay, uh, where would you fit into the bookstore? How would you
Right.
categorize it into the bookstore? and
Yeah.
and um but I definitely I've always found history as part of my motivation and inspirations, and finding ideas, and it's definitely the first thing that I go to as a history writer. Yeah.
And how about you guys, Erik, Kris? Did the history bring you to fiction, or did the fiction bring you to history, or does it really not matter? I mean, that's always a possibility too.
Well, I think for me, I mean, first and foremost, I think of myself as an artist,
Mhm.
and kind of in the
Mhm.
same breath as a writer. I mean, that's really what motivates me. And I think, I mean, this touches on what I was saying with my earlier question, this connection between the past and the present. For me, there isn't really any separation there. Yeah, I mean, the human experience is the human experience. And I think, well, I think any historian knows that way down in their marrow. Um, And I think for me, it's all about just writing about, what are these characters feeling? What are these characters doing? Why are they doing the things they're doing? And I mean, the circumstances that any person is living in change throughout time. I mean, everyone knows that. But the experience of being a human being and having to deal with trauma or happiness, or I mean, all these things that get thrown in your way as a human being. I mean, that really hasn't changed at all. And for me, that's what makes me interested in writing fiction. I mean, and I mean, honestly, I get, I think I get talked about as a historical fiction writer because I've written some historical novels, but I mean, two of my novels are set in present day, so I don't really think of myself as a historical fiction writer, which I'm going to say in the same breath, I love historical fiction. But, for me, it's all about the characters, not about the history.
Yeah. How about you, for you, Erik? You have your PhD in history. So did you all along kind of want to write a historical novel, or did that come out of your love of the history?
Mhm. Yeah, I think my book, it just came out of a love of history. And having said that, though, I wanted to branch out, into, how should I put it? Just to build on what Kris just said, I wanted to be an artist as well, a creator. And think about historical fiction, it gives you a freedom to go beyond, because with writing nonfiction history, there's a saying, historians are prisoners of the documents. We can't go beyond what's in the documents or oral histories, for example. But with historical fiction, it's limitless. There's a freedom, and I wanted to embrace that. And so, I still thought of myself as a historian writing the book, but I also embraced this new identity, as an artist, creator, sort of simultaneously, you could say. So, but yeah, nonfiction history writing, again, it's there's limits. Just to repeat what I said, you're a prisoner of the documents of oral history. And with historical fiction, you can stay faithful to the history, but you can also create for yourself this whole new world, freedom, imagination. So that's what I was thinking.
So we beaten that question to death. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you.
Oh, no, not at all. My apologies. I have a little tiny doggy that he thinks he's the the biggest protector in the world. So I was on mute for a second there. Yeah, so I guess that would lead me to my questions.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm curious as to um as becoming published, and what would you consider to be the hardest question that you've ever received in interviews? And there are some questions that have really caught me off guard. And I'm like, oh, I will give, how about we circle back to that? And it's usually personal, like more personal questions, like what is your motivation for being a writer? Or what do you hope readers will get from your book after it's done? And I'm always like, the deer in the headlights, where I can talk about the writing process very easily and it just comes naturally. um yes, so that would bring me to Kris. Oh no, yeah,
Yeah,
excuse
well,
me.
I actually have something to say about this. Probably the hardest question that I ever get asked is talk about your process.
Oh,
Because
so
and because well, like my wife, for example, who is a very talented poet and author, she went through the MFA program here at UAF. And and I'm not an MFA writer. I have a master's degree, but it's not an MFA. And so for me, I'm largely self-taught as a writer just by reading and writing and putting my work out there. And but one of the big advantages of being an MFA writer, and something I'm often jealous of my wife for, is that she has the vocabulary to talk about this kind of stuff, about process and all that. And when I get asked that question, I'm just like, I don't know. I park my butt in a chair and I write. That's all I know how to do. And yeah, I mean, I got to remember Lily's suggestion, I guess, to say we're going to circle back to that, and then I presume redirect the conversation in ways that don't lead back to that question. Like, oh, gee, we're out of time.
Yeah.
Who's next?
Um,
Should we do this like tag? I'm
Eric,
gonna
have you
tag.
gotten any difficult questions before, Eric, when people ask you about your book or your writing process?
Yeah, that's a good one. I haven't really I guess I really to think about it, I really haven't had that I can think off the top of my head really hard, difficult questions. I just when I have had people ask me, well, what was your process, how did you come to this particular topic of the maritime fur trade? And I launch into long-winded answers about, I love Alaska history, and this topic has always fascinated me. And the biggest problem I have is, when I've spoken with people in the past, they've asked me that question. I can go on and on. It's like I'm back in the classroom giving a lecture to a class, and I just have to. The hardest part for me is just, okay, stop. That's enough information. See if they have any follow-up questions. So, but yeah, and I would agree with Kris. I sort of have the same issue. People ask, when I get questions about writing process, I say, well, for me, it was sort of a lot of, I already said this earlier, but a lot of chaotic back and forth between writing and research, and sort of trying to blend the two, in a coherent process. And that's something I'm going to try to strive for, as my goal is to write some more historical fiction, and I'm going to try to be more disciplined, in my writing process and research process going forward. But yeah, so just to summarize once again, I can't think of any, really difficult questions I've been asked, but for me, it's knowing when to stop as far as giving explanations and answers, and being disciplined about that. So
Yeah, Lily, I'm with you. I can talk all day about my writing process, and I'm always curious to hear about other people's writing processes. Where I usually get is when I first come out with a book, eventually I get asked a question that sort of is like an arrow right to the heart of what some personal part of it for me. And that kind of throws me back because I'm not a memoir writer. I don't really particularly like talking about my personal life so when something so like with the snow child, very early on, I started getting questions about, well, have you dealt with infertility? And I don't know how I didn't expect that question. Like, it's an obvious question based on that book. But the first few times, and I wear my heart a little bit on my sleeve. I tend to probably talk too openly sometimes about so trying to kind of compartmentalize and be able to talk about my books and my experience in a way that I don't feel like I'm being too personal with a bunch of strangers. And that's for me has been a constant challenge, even like with my social media and stuff, of like how close to let strangers in, and which is weird because when you're writing, I think whether you mean to or not, we put so much of ourselves into our writing. Even if even if it's historical fiction and we're writing about these characters so long ago. And it's interesting because in reading all of your guys' books, I really felt these moments where I felt like there was definitely this very vibrant beating heart. And I know that has to come from you guys, and it's a vulnerable position to be in, I think, a little bit as a writer, when you're suddenly up on a stage and someone's asking you, so have you dealt with infertility? And you're like, whew, okay, let me, those are the hard questions for me. But I get to a point where I can answer them and it feels a little bit like I'm stepping outside of myself and answering them as someone else or something. I don't know. It's a kind of funny thing, but yeah.
Yeah, you do kind of learn to develop a stage presence.
Yeah,
That's
I guess that is what it is. Like a
the
stage
stage version
persona
of you.
kind of almost. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting that you just mentioned that the stage process. When I, when I was writing my book, when I was doing my, thinking about my characters, I did think about actors a lot, and I thought of like a movie, I know it might sound strange, but when I write, I always think of it visually. And, I thought, what would this be like if I was watching this on a movie screen, with or talking with actors. And so that did play at least it was one dimension of my writing, coming at it from the perspective of, actors and so forth. So
Yeah, that's fun.
Well, so the obvious question is here, who would you want to play the lead? I mean, were you playing that game at the desk when you were writing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't really think of any. I just sort of had generic, I was just thinking of wasn't thinking of any actual real life actors. I just had sort of this generic sense of actors,
Yeah.
I know it sounds
Yeah.
strange, but that's
No.
the way I thought.
Yeah, I have a list of actors I think would be good in certain parts, for sure. And I like that, visualizing it as a movie. I've recently started thinking of scenes as a diorama, and these little miniatures of, just to help me think of the different layers, and if I was building this diorama from scratch, where would I begin? I'm uh, like, what would the uh, forest look like outside of the building? What is the structure of the building? What type of building supplies would they be using? And history, I see my writing as the actors inside. They're the ones on the stage. But the history is the teeth of it, is those details that really bring it to life, and how those actors are going to act within that environment.
Yeah, and I've never thought of actors. I don't think not, but I do like to have like I've got a cork board where I just put up a lot of images. So I'll look for online, randomly look for people that kind of I think that's what my character might look like a little bit, and I cut out those photographs and I put up photographs of just different art. And because sometimes it's like an image that just sort of inspires a feeling that I'm trying to capture, if it's a painting or a sculpture. So I'll cut out, so I've got this collage of stuff that kind of helps feed the process for me, and remind me of like where I started from, I guess, like that initial feeling that character gave me or that setting gave me, and to try to kind of keep that going, because I don't know about you guys, but I mean it's a long it's a long process for me. I don't write a novel in a year. It takes me a long time. So to try to remember that initial excitement and feeling that you had going in with the idea, to try to keep that alive is sometimes a trick for me.
I years ago, after Turnigan, my second novel came out, I had the very surreal experience of twice seeing people on the street who looked exactly like what my imagination pictured my main characters as. I don't know if that's ever happened to you guys, but both times it was in Homer, and one of them was actually, I think he was actually a homeless gentleman. He looked like he was part Athabascan, part white. He was just walking across the parking lot at Ulmer's, and I was like, "That's Alexander Campbell. Oh my God, what are you doing here?" and and I mean, another was the female lead in the book, Polly Parker. There was this. I think it was a Kachemak Bay Writers Conference. One of the presenters was like, it was the same deal. Like, oh my God, what are you doing here? And it's, I don't know, sometimes the membrane between your imagination and the rest of the world gets thinned out to the point where you can pass right through it.
Yeah, I've had a few surreal moments. So when I wrote Bright Edge of the World, we don't get hummingbirds in our part of Alaska. I think like 20 years ago, my husband saw one, that'd gotten blown off course or something. And right as I was finishing Bright Edge, which the hummingbird has a big part in it, a hummingbird flew into our yard. And it was the
What?
most surreal. And I don't really, I mean, even though I love writing about the supernatural, I don't tend to like actively believe in a lot of different things like that. And my husband was like, I think and I was like, oh my gosh, it's a hummingbird. So then when I was writing the new book, I was up in my little writing shack and I was writing some bear attack scenes, which play a part in my new book. And my husband had gone for a hike up the hill. And again, we don't tend to get a lot of grizzly bears right in our yard. And my husband got charged by a sow grizzly with cubs as he was
Oh,
coming
wow.
down the hill. And he said, he joked, he's like, next time I think you need to write a nice little book about some bunny rabbits or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe a book where we win the lottery or something.
It is kind of a surreal feeling though, because you're in your head and then all of a sudden it's like, wait, did I just like make this happen? I mean, is that very strange?
Hey, life imitates art,
Well,
do we want to move?
Oh,
Go ahead. If you got a question,
well,
go ahead.
I have a whole, I really enjoyed reading all your guys' books. And I was thinking, I might have mentioned this to you all earlier. Like, I think someone needs to do a book club with all of our books. I just think that they like one, thing, because they all, I feel like have this great dynamic between them and interact really interestingly with each other. But a question I wanted to ask all of you, as I was reading them, in each book, there was a dynamic between two characters that was just so vivid. And I wanted to ask each of you, did those relationships, those characters, that connection between them, did you discover that through the historical research, or was it some aspect of just human nature? So for example, Erik, in yours, it was the brothers, Joshua and Elias, that it was just very, very compelling. Same with, in Kris, yours, is it Lucan and Zia? Those two characters.
Yuki.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, those two characters again, that like it gets my, you're just like, oh, there's so much energy there. And Lily, I mean, the mother-daughter relationship and that draw between them, and both the mother character and the daughter character, just, I mean, I'll never get the image out of my head of the little girl with her ladle out trying to, paddle home. It's just, so I'm just curious with all of you guys, did those relationships develop? Did you have those ideas kind of those characters and those relationships going in? Did it develop out of the research, or did it come from like some personal experience or sense of how humans are that brought, because there was just so much energy, I felt like, in all those relationships and characters.
Yeah.
Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. For you mentioned the characters, my main character, Joshua Hall, and his older brother, Elias, who, Kris, that made me think you wrote a review of my book, and you mentioned Elias Hall was sort of this, out of, Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad, kind of Colonel Kurtz from Apocalypse Now. And it's funny that you wrote that in review, because when I created Elias, the older brother character, I exactly thought of Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, and also, it was electrifying to read your review of my book, because I also thought of Colonel Kurtz, the character in Apocalypse Now, this dark, very bright, very educated person who's turned inward and embraced sort of the darker side of human nature. And so to answer your question, I would say I took inspiration from as I mentioned, other authors, probably especially Conrad, but I think and some of it came out of my research, and I researched the maritime fur trade. There were a lot of rivalries between I'm talking about the actual history between real captains and some of their officers and sailors, and I thought, you know, a good dynamic to keep tension from almost the very beginning of the story would be have that that tension, that unknown of quality between not just sailors, but you know, blood, you know, brothers, to have that family connection. So yeah, just to summarize, you know, I took inspiration from other literature and films in thinking of the characters, and again, loosely based on you know, real life historical rivalries that I found.
Well, maybe I'll go next if nobody has any objections. Well, so the relationship between Lukine and Zia, well, Lukine is a real person from Alaska's history. Zia is just a figment of my imagination. But I had written this scene early on where Lukine was like a 13-year-old boy. He was in Sitka in boarding school, and he encounters Zia. It's that scene where he encounters her first on the beach. And I had just kind of wrote that, when you write your first draft, a lot of times you write stuff that you don't really know what's going to happen with it, or if it's even going to be in the finished version. And this was kind of one of those scenes. And I did cut a lot of scenes out of the book. I mean, the first draft was like I'd written War and Peace or something like that. So I had to cut stuff, but I just couldn't bring myself to kill that darling that was that scene. And so I was like, well, if she's going to be in the book, I got to do something. But what do I do? And I couldn't really think of anything. And I don't know, it sounds like the dopiest thing in the world, but I'm sure we've all had it. Inspiration just struck one day. And I was like, oh, that's what's going on. She's a monster, and so the relationship between those two really, it develops over years and years. It's she's kind of slowly working on him throughout the book, but eventually she gets tired and goes after his best friend. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know who of you have read I guess Ewoyn, you've read the book, but I don't know who has and who hasn't. I don't want to give away too much, yeah. But
it's a great dynamic though. It's such a great dynamic. It's a very haunting, it's a great.
Well, among other things, it struck me as a way to really sort of reveal some things about Lukine's character, or at least as I imagined it. I have no idea what the real Yvonne Lukine was like, but again, it's more about the age in which it's written. It's more about my stuff than it is about Lukine's, as the artist. But it was a good way to sort of kind of sneak in some expository things about his nature and who he was. So that's how that came about.
Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning that, about the mother and daughter relationship. And the story actually began as a Tlingit story because I'm also Tlingit, but I knew from the outset that I wanted it to be centered around a child. And the characters kind of grew from the child. But with the ladle and the little tools that she had, that's actually drawn from my mother. And she told me about this little tiny stool that we had, that was a triangle and it had a little hole in it. And she said that they'd always carry this little stool on the ice to sit on, but also in an emergency, they use it as a paddle. They'd also be carrying like a staff. And as I was doing research, found that there was some essential tools that hunters had, including the little stool and the staff. That relationship between the mother and daughter, of course, it is the relationship between me and my own children, and how I speak to them. That was a good and I don't want to give it away how the ending. But that relationship is one of my favorites, between a mother and children. That's definitely what the story is about a mother's love. But I find how they react in certain situations. I definitely have to have um, like a lot of details and research done to know how that they would react. I'm now writing a story about a volcano eruptions that happened in Nass Valley, and there's so much that is unknown to me in that time period, that I knew I had these certain characters that are experiencing an eruption, but what how would they react? A lot of it is also inspired by Mount Spur. I don't know if you're here in Anchorage when Mount Spur erupted, but I was 15, and for some reason, me and my best friend missed the city bus, or maybe the city bus wasn't even running because they're probably like everybody needs to go home. And being teenagers, we're like, well, just walk to your house, and not knowing any dangers. And suddenly, like the sky was like half black, and then pretty soon it was all black, and we were walking. We were about halfway there to her house, and the ash was so dense. I was walking, hiding my face, and it was so gritty. And I could only walk a few steps and then open my eyes. And then it was very, very unreal, apocalyptic. But once I have all those details in place, then I can see how these certain characters are going to react. What are their first thoughts as they're going through the scene? Yeah.
Yeah,
Good
it
question.
reminds me of, I always joke that when I first start writing a manuscript, I always feel like I'm holding up these like paper puppets that don't seem real to me. And I'm like making them talk to each other. And it feels really awkward and stupid and like this is not working at all. And I feel
Nobody's
like
gonna
it's
read
kind of
this.
like, I feel like kind of the research, like it made me think that it's not just the research into the history, but it's kind of like you're researching your characters too along the way. Who are they? How are they going to respond, like you say, in these different situations, partly based on their background, who they are, what baggage they're carrying, all that. And that takes so long. It takes, and sometimes I don't really feel like it's till I get to the end of the novel that I finally, okay, now I know these people. And then sometimes it's a matter of going back and bringing some of that flesh in earlier on that I've figured out about them during the writing process. Because it can take a while to get to know, for me anyways, it takes me a while to really get to know them enough to make them seem really, hopefully, human and real to other people.
Yeah, I was at the risk of I don't know, hijacking the conversation. I was gonna say, Lily, I got caught out in that eruption too myself. And I mean, I remember, I mean, I was out riding my mountain bike. I mean, probably in Bicentennial Park, although back then everyone just called it the trails behind Service High. Um, and yeah, like I remember I ended up having to walk home because I couldn't breathe enough to ride my bike,
Oh
you
my
know.
gosh.
But
Gosh. Yeah, it was so unreal. I mean, it was just like the day turned into night, and we were really caught in, gosh, inches of ash. It was cleaning, replacing the filters, and people clearing out their driveways of
yeah,
ash. Yeah.
yeah, it was no fun. Well, do people mind if I ask a question? This has all been super awesome. I've been really enjoying this. Um, I guess I want to ask about world building in your novels. And I mean, I think every novelist has to do this to some degree. Like even a Tom Clancy spy novel has to have some world building to sort of prop up the story. Um, but I guess it usually gets talked about in terms of like sci-fi novels or fantasy, Lord of the Rings kind of stuff. But I'm wondering, you know, how do you guys approach it? Because there's this thing in when you're world building in your historical novel, you have the facts of history that have to be at some level respected. Um, and so, it's not like you can just make it up out of whole cloth like you can with like a, sci-fi space opera kind of novel. And I'm wondering, how do you guys build your worlds? How do you decide what's important what must be in there and what can get left out? And
Yes, I
I'll throw that back to Lily.
Okay, great. Yeah, yes, I love this question, and I agree. I'm such a big fan of world building, and I see that too. Is people see that more as for sci-fi, or like these magical worlds where, like Tolkien, what do these creatures, what magical powers do they have? Type of thinking. But I really like the world building as a tool, for writing, because I want it to have dimension. I usually start with, a map of the area. I'm really obsessed with maps too. I try and find a really good map of the area with the different elevations, which can be hard to find. In Tuzroyluke, I mapped out the journey. They take a very long journey, and I was looking everywhere in Anchorage for a map that had elevation. I didn't even think of like these mountain climbing, shops later on. But at the time, I could only find like road atlas. I couldn't find anything specific, and I needed something across the Arctic. And I was returning home from, a native event, Alaska Federation of Natives, and I was throwing my recycling. And when I was throwing recycling, I saw some maps in the from like USGS, and I knew like there's going to be maps in there, good maps, and I was like, oh my God, am I really going to jump into this dumpster?
That's awesome.
And so I was like, don't think about it, just jump. And so I literally, like, I just came back from AFN. I had these big native earrings, and I was wearing, like a dress to go to this event. So I did some dumpster diving for my maps. Yeah,
Awesome.
and I got them. But
I got to remember that tip for the future when I need a map.
Yeah, so maps are one of my favorite, ways to build the world that I'm in. And as an Indigenous person, I look at the, Indigenous groups surrounding the area, because we definitely interacted with the tribes in our area, and also, um, natural disasters, that happened in the area, wars, that just happened, that are occurring or are just happening. My process, at the moment, is in setting up the scene, I will, collect keywords that I know that are going to be in this certain scene that I know I'm going to use in that section. Yeah. Great question.
Yeah, it's funny, Lily, because I almost do the complete opposite. For all of my books, I've invented this imaginary Wolverine River because I didn't want to be I just know, having worked at a local newspaper for a decade, like if you describe a certain bend in the river and everyone's going to be like, that's not how it goes. That's not, in that year there'd been this flood and blah, blah, blah. And I found that so aggravating, and like it's sort of impinging on my imagination. And so I invented this Wolverine River. But then the funny part is I got a really wonderful artist, Ruth Hulbert, to draw the map of this river. And it I think it's been a little bit of a challenge for her, because sometimes it's a lot like the Copper River and sometimes it's a lot like the Matanuska River. And so she's drawing the map of and she's great at it. And so she created the map of my imagination, which I just love. And then when the new book came out, and she said, I don't even know, I would love to do a map for this one because it's changed yet again. So I kind of like that freedom, and it goes into the world building of like, not like, as much as the landscape means everything to my fiction, I want to be able to move mountains and streams and do it the way I want to do it, and not have things, because I found that I would get hung up on details that would kind of ruin how I wanted to do it. So I thought, I'm gonna do whatever I want.
Yeah, I like that. I think that was mentioned earlier about there's so much freedom in history to write, and I like that. I like that advice.
Mhm. Yeah, I would just add to as far as world building, for my book, I just became familiar with a lot of the common words that were used, like for example, the maritime world, as far as you know, basic maritime nautical language. But I was very conscious when I wrote the book not to do too much of it. Don't browbeat the reader with. I tried to make it as obvious as far as what what the ship was doing, or like of course we don't call them ropes. You call them sheets or halyards, or these various sailing terminology. But I was very careful to include it, but not use it too much. And so things like that, words, I think, common terminology from a historical era or a certain profession, again, maritime industry. I think being familiar with the vocabulary, the language is very important. And, even in some cases, using words that are not necessarily English to tell a story. If you remember the early part of my book, once again, the Juan Fernandez Islands, I had some Spanish dialogue, and I try to use it as even if a reader doesn't understand Spanish, they could sort of get the gist of the situation, what was being communicated, for example. So language, and I think everyone's books here, obviously the land, the natural environment, wildlife. I did a lot of research as far as different animal species in different parts of the world where the eclipse went, and so I think just capturing a sense of the place, even if it's very brief, just wildlife, the weather, the physical conditions. That's also very important.
Yeah, and I have to say, I love this idea, Lily, of a diorama thing. I think that's such a fun way to think about world building, because it also is kind of, it can be a little overwhelming, and it kind of confines it to this, how I'm picturing you describing it. It's like a small scene that you're constructing as an art thing, and this idea of like language and careers and all the stuff that kind of fit the language of different, it all creates those worlds, and it's really, I like that idea a lot.
Who's next for the question?
Oh, is it my turn or someone
I
else?
don't even know anymore.
I think I jumped in when it wasn't
I
my
lost
turn.
track. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I lost
It
it.
doesn't matter.
I can throw a question out there. I just was curious how you approach using real life historical figures in historical fiction, because I had a few people in my novel who were you know, real historical figures. They weren't necessarily in the story, but they were sometimes referenced. For example, um, so it's tricky, I think, you know, because I've read a lot of historical fiction over the years, and you know, sometimes some authors will portray real life people, but in some novels they'll try to be as accurate as possible as far as what the person did, what they said. Other novels will take more license, and of course movies do the same thing. You know, they'll change up, take a little bit of license with real life historical figures when they interact with fictional characters. So I was just curious how you approach that topic as far as using fictional characters interacting with you know, real life historical figures. So.
Should I go first?
Go for it, Kris. Go for
Everybody
it.
seems to be looking at each other, daring each other to go first. Well, so there, you know, in Seasons of Want and Plenty, there, I mean, there's a whole lot of characters in there who were real people. I mean, Ewoyn Ivey was a real person. I mean, Alexander Baranov was a real person. George Adams, all these people with the telegraph expedition that came along in the 1865. I mean, those are all real people. Major Kennicott. Um, and so I guess I almost took an approach of being almost more like almost a journalistic approach to it, where I was like, well, okay, there's a story here that happened, and you know, how did, you know, and a lot of what I wrote about Lukine was stuff that I was able to pull out of the history, and I had to read between the lines a little bit. But then there's these fictional characters that I had to put in there to sort of fill in the gaps, because you know, boy, I could talk about this for hours, but I'll try to constrain myself. I know we all have other things to do, but well, I actually set out to write a nonfiction book, like a history book of Yvonne Lukine, and it was sort of going to be like a one part history, one part daily life in Russian Alaska, one part people's history of Russian Alaska kind of thing. And I don't know, I did a lot of research and I wrote maybe 20,000 words, and I was like, well, there's like just enough history here to be interesting, but not enough history here to where I could actually draw concrete conclusions about things. And so those gaps are kind of what, when I finally threw up my hands and said I'm going to write a novel, those gaps were filled in by these characters, these made up characters. Like, well, Zia is one of them, and who else? I think Lukine's ex-wife, Iriana. Geez, I can't remember the names of my characters in my own book. I mean, she actually, the real Yvonne Lukine was married to a native lady whose Russian name was Iriana, but that's like all I could find out about her. And so she's kind of functionally a fictional character in the book. And you know, and he had a daughter named Anastasia, who again, that's all I could find out. So I had to fill that in. And that's really what those characters do in that story, you know, in terms of just like the functioning of how the story works. But yeah, you know, sometimes you just gotta make it up, you know, and that's all the fun of writing historical fiction.
Yeah, and I kind of did the same thing that I did with my landscape, that so with The Bright Edge of the World was inspired by a real expedition in 1885 by a young man named Henry Allen, but I wanted the freedom again to tell my own story. And so I was clear in my acknowledgments, like the root of the story, where it came from. I relied a lot on the documents, but I came up with Alan Forrester. I wanted him to be older. I wanted the freedom to explore his relationships without, and I don't know about you guys, but I wasn't comfortable. And it was funny because I think right around the time the book came out, one of Henry Allen's descendants, I think it was actually like a nephew, reached out to me and was like, hey, I'm really excited about this book. And it was a very pleasant interaction, but it made me realize that I was glad that I hadn't tried to tell his great uncle's, you know, give thoughts and emotions and character to this man that was actually who he knew was his, you know, his relative. So I've actually been a little bit shy. I tend to like change the characters' names, do things so that I feel less constrained by history, in that sense, that I don't want to try to tell. So I'm curious to see what anybody else thinks about this. Kris, did you ever have any discomfort or worry about the fact that he was a real man? And did it ever?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, the Lukine family, there is still a Lukine family that lives on Kodiak. I would presume they're related to him. I mean, like Ivan Lukine's great grandfather was one of Shelikoff's men, I think, who did a lot of bad things on Kodiak back in the day. And I mean, I presume they're descended or related to Lukine in some way. I mean, I think Ivan Lukine doesn't come off looking like a jerk. I mean, he's as human as the next person. You know, he makes mistakes, but you know, I'm certainly not writing about him as, you know, being some kind of
Villain.
jerk. You know, but yeah, that definitely has entered my mind. You know, especially in, you know, Alaska's a small world, and people in Alaska with roots in Russian Alaska are an even smaller world. And you know, but you know, at the end of the day, for me, there wasn't any way to approach this other than to write about him using his name, because I mean, to me, he's such a fascinating character, and you know, and he's like completely unknown to most Alaskans, to the rest of the world, but he was this really amazing guy. And so really what the novels are, they're an homage to him and his family. And I mean, if any of the modern day Lukine descendants come across that, I mean, I hope they take it that way. I mean,
Yeah, that is it. It can be difficult to have real characters and your stories. I do have two based on their involvement in Tikak and Point Hope. One was John Beach Driggs, who was a reverend that came to Point Hope, and then he was the first reverend to come to Point Hope from the Episcopal Church, and then he ended up spending his life there. And he's buried there. The other one was Captain Healy, a well-known figure. And I wanted, in the very start, I knew that I needed to be very respectful of these two characters who have living relatives. And there was just an immense amount of research that I did for the both of them. Captain Healy, luckily there's been books written about him, so it was easy to research his life. But with Dr. Driggs, Reverend Driggs, it was a little bit more difficult, but I did find things that he had written, and even where he went to, where he had a medical practice in New York, looked on Google Maps, that type of thing. And it's also in doing that, I was writing from the first person, that I'm writing a gender, a different gender than my own. I'm writing from a different race than my own. And in both of those, I want to make sure that I have tons of backstory to that character. And I want to fight any stereotypes that exist about that character. My writing, I make a very strong point that if I'm writing a different gender or different race, that my characters fight any stereotypes that exist. So it's doing, I want my writing to reflect that I've put in work. When a reader walks away, they can feel good about how I portrayed their relative in that. But I definitely enjoyed both of them. I mean, because they knew each other. These two men, non-native men, and their history in Point Hope. It was so I was so drawn to them. And you know, why did they go to Point Hope? Why did they choose this career? Why become a reverend? And John Beach Driggs, he was a really interesting man that he was a surgeon before he was a reverend, and he worked at an immigrant hospital. He was the doctor for the opera in New York, and it's these type of characters that I had that moment where I'm like, that guy's gonna go in the book, and you have that moment of like euphoria that writers love, that writers crave, is that moment of, yes, that's going in.
Yeah, and that brings up such an interesting thing too, the idea that real people are so complicated, and their motives are complicated, unlike stereotypes or cliches. So it is interesting to think that, like, within history, and I guess it did happen with me even with Henry Allen, that in his writings at times seemed very curious and open to meeting different cultures, but at the same time his job was to document how to control these populations. And in that, really strange, to me, they felt like two parts that couldn't exist in one person, but they did. And I think that's because humans are complicated. And so, you know, I think we can kind of, in that research, take cues from people that are maybe pleasantly surprise us or unpleasantly surprise us with what their background or what they're capable of. Or it's really interesting.
Yeah, I would just to answer my own question there. For my book, I thought about real life characters, and I ended up just being very cautious. The real people, the real historical figures in the book, I only mentioned by name, and like the Eclipse ship owner Thomas Perkins, he was a real person in Boston, a big merchant, but you know, he was only referenced by name, and I had letters written by him. But as far as actual interactions, I shied away from that. You know, I'm gonna just stick with my fictional characters here. And there's a brief reference to Alexander Baranov, of course, you know, real person on who in 1802 was over on, you know, he had his headquarters over there on Kodiak Island, and not in Southeast Alaska. So, you know, just a very passing reference to I stuck with just very minor mentions of real life figures, but because it is for me, you know, being a, you know, history professor, and you know, it's very complicated, you know, something I got to work out and think about more heavily in writing more historical fiction in the future. So.
Did everybody get to ask a question? 2 questions?
Yep, I think I got my two asked. Really
Yeah.
Okay,
I mean,
great.
I got more and more.
Okay.
I'm sure everybody has limited time.
I guess that means I'll be the last person to ask a question if we're nearing towards the end. And this is always my favorite questions. What is your current project?
Ah.
And I will pass that on to Kris.
Oh, geez.
Egg, you're it.
Yeah. Well, so I actually have a novel that I wrote last winter. It's set in a sort of like near term, sort of like near future dystopian version of Alaska, where the United States is sort of like devolved into essentially an apartheid government, and they're I mean, long story short, a series of people who have sort of reconstituted the Underground Railroad to move young children of color out of camps, like concentration camps, to over the border to safety in Canada. Right now, I've been telling people it's either the best fiction I've ever written or it's 85,000 words of self-indulgent crap. And I can't decide which one it is at this point, you know. So that's kind of the project that's like most immediately on my desk. Yeah, I have another couple of, I mean, I always have books percolating in my head. It's more a matter of having time to park my butt in that chair and write them. Yeah.
Yeah,
And Ewoyn tag. Oh,
go
Erik,
ahead, Kris.
go ahead. I was just going to tag Ewoyn, but
No,
go ahead.
You go, Erik. You go next.
Oh yeah, well, for myself, it's I'm like Kris. You know, sometimes it's hard to get time, but I squeeze in fiction writing whenever when I as best I can when I'm not teaching classes or going to committee meetings for the university, and the summertime is a key time for me to write because I'm not teaching, and but I'm actually working. I want to say my next project actually consists of two different projects. I'm actually writing. I'm not sure what I'm going to go with next. I'm writing actually both a prequel and a sequel to Voyage of the Eclipse, and I'm not sure what I want to go with first. I've got two stories, and I've written one of them. I've written most of it. I'm almost done with it. The other one I've written a good chunk of, but I'm trying to, what should I go with next? I'm trying to figure that out. So, but it builds on the Voyage of the Eclipse story. So still trying to figure out what I want to go with.
I'd like to read that. It sounds cool.
Yeah, so I'm in that phase. My new book's finally done and it comes out in February. And it seems like after every novel I complete, I go through this phase of feeling like I don't think I want to do that again. So that's the phase that I'm at right now. I don't know. I find it, and I don't know if you guys all find this too. It's both a pleasant and unpleasant feeling when your brain is just so much in this other world for so long. In ways I really enjoy it, but I find in ways I'm not as present in the real world when I'm working so heavily on a piece of fiction. And it kind of wrings me out. I almost feel like a little bit of a hangover when I'm done of just like, oh, I put every drop of everything I could possibly do. And so right now I'm just like, maybe I'm not writing another novel, but my family doesn't believe me. They think I won't be able to resist. So we'll see what happens.
I remember it's been several years ago, you and I did that event at the UAA bookstore, and I asked you this question, and you said, I really want the option to not write any more books.
It's totally true. I'm looking at my other career options now. How about you, Lily? Are you working on something?
I am working on a residential school story in British Columbia, based upon a residential school that my grandfather attended in Chilliwack, British Columbia. And it is 1950s. My grandfather was from the very northern part of British Columbia, from the Nass River. But Chilliwack is really close to the Canadians, very south, very close to the Canadian-US border. It's almost parallel to Vancouver. And it's a difficult subject because it's really child abuse and child sexual abuse that happen, and it can be difficult. Even what am I going to read? what am I going to share with others? Would it be appropriate for me to read these horrible experiences, but also knowing that the abuse happened and it's based upon history, and it's this tremendous wound that happened to Indigenous peoples, and it's been a process. And a big part of it is I grew up in Alaska, even though I'm a quarter Nishka, and I just don't have the same knowledge of Indigenous peoples of Alaska, like in British Columbia, as I do in Alaska. But it's coming along, and it's very much self-discovery of learning. Yeah, I lived there for a brief time in high school, but it's still a lot of self-discovery and learning about my own peoples. Yeah.
Kris, did you almost seemed like, Kris, you had another question that you were thinking of, or that you
Oh, I had a list of them. I mean, I didn't know how long we were going to go. I mean, I can ask another question, but I don't know what other
yeah,
people
no,
have to do.
I kind of feel the same way. I could keep going on and on, but I don't know if everybody has things that they need to go do. But it's really been fun talking with all of you. It's really inspiring and fun.
Yeah, it's a little weird doing that. I've never done one of these over Zoom before, you know,
Yeah.
but
I haven't either.
it'd be fun to get all of us in a room together and eat lunch together sometime.
Absolutely. I would love that. Absolutely.